Hello, friends. I'm Eldon Beery. We moved to Glacier Hills in September of 2019. My wife and I live in the Meadows, 146. Katie is the treasure of my life. We've been married 71 years now, and she still puts up with me. It's interesting to get to know you people here at Glacier Hills. My last pastorate was at Ann Arbor First Presbyterian, and I used to visit some of you here before we moved in. In preparation for today to introduce myself, I tried to get out my time chart that I keep on the computer. It's, as you can see, I've had a very colorful past. I have arranged this so that I have different colors for the different places and times I've lived, gone to school, different places. Excuse me. I was born, my parents were both born in Iowa and were married there in southwestern Iowa. And after their second child died, Blue Baby, they called them in those days, he decided to go into the ministry, and so they moved to Findlay, Ohio, where there was a college, and they were working their way through school, of course. And they became the house parents for a boys' dormitory at Findlay College in Findlay, Ohio. That sounds unusual today, but I was born there on the kitchen table in the boys' dormitory. Fortunately, that old building still stands, but it's been relocated across the street from where it was when I was born there. The physician came to the dormitory and enabled my birth there. We lived there a few years, I'm told. I don't remember those very early days. But the next time I remember anything, we were living in Neptune, Ohio, which is a little tiny village in Mercer County. And my father was pastor of a church there. He had graduated from school and was an ordained minister in the North American Churches of God when he started. We lived there for several years and moved to Fort Wayne, Indiana, where he became pastor of a church. And at that time, I think I was in kindergarten. I went to a preschool, and so we were there for 5 years through I finished the 4th grade. And then we moved back to Findlay, Ohio. And he was invited to go there and be a part-time professor at Findlay College and the pastor of the college church. He was a very interesting person. So was my mother. Those were early days, of course. I was born in 1929, and it was a community, although Fort Wayne seemed like a pretty good-sized city. It was a community that I was able to walk to and from school when I was very early age and felt fairly safe. I was able to play around in the backyard and help build a rock garden, and we had our first dog there. I began to venture out a little bit, but not very much. We then moved to Findlay, Ohio again, where my father was to be, and I was in the 5th and 6th grades, about a block and a half from where we lived. We lived in 2 different houses then. In fact, I've lived in 33 different towns or locations, different houses in my lifetime, so I don't know if I can remember all of them or not. I think that varied background is what makes my life more exciting for me. When we were in Findlay that time, I remember coming home from church one Sunday with my parents, and walking down the street and some neighbors opened the door and went out on the front porch and say, "The Japs just bombed Pearl Harbor." And that pretty radically changed my life in those early years. My father became some kind of a home person where he went around with had a big wooden stick that he carried and an armband that said he was in charge of things. I remember the windows on the front, or the lights on the front of the cars had a half-inch wide or half-inch high and 2-inch wide part that was not covered in tape. We were expecting bombing to happen in the U.S. at some time, but fortunately that didn't happen in Findlay. With about a year afterward, as all of the students from the college where my dad was teaching began drafted and went into the military service, he decided he should join them, and he became a chaplain. His first assignment was to be, I was in the 7th and 8th grade during that time, junior high school in Findlay, and heard the president declare war the day after the bombing in Pearl Harbor. My father was assigned to a naval hospital in Treasure Island in the middle of San Francisco Bay. It's where the Bay Bridge has its footing on Goat Island, and Treasure Island was an old garbage dump next to it, which they made into a place for a World's Fair and a hospital. I was in the 9th grade there. We lived in 2 different apartments during that time and a house earlier, so in 3 different locations during my 9th grade. I'm not sure why we moved around so much, but it may have been we were given housing of some sort. From those days, I remember going to visit my father after I got out of school on some days. My mother was working at a place building life rafts, sewing them, and my father was at the Naval Hospital, and I could go visit him there afterward by riding the train over to the island. Then he got shipped overseas to Espiritu Santo, New Hebrides, where a naval hospital was in the South Pacific, and my mother and I returned to Findlay. We lived in a little apartment for a couple of months, and then we moved into a different apartment and upstairs of someone's house, and then we moved back to San Diego for a summer. My father had developed a lot of intestinal bleeding, and they had sent him back, and after he was in Chicago hospital for about 2 months, they assigned him to San Diego Balboa Park, which had a building converted into a naval hospital. And he served there, and I went to I didn't go to school at all there, but I lived in 2 different places in San Diego during that summer. And my mother and I returned, and my sister, who was with us, with her husband, who was a Navy officer also, we returned to a place in Findlay again, and I became pretty active in the high school then. The dean of the high school was trying to take good care of me, I have the feeling. But I was given the lead in a play called The Fool by Channing Pollock. And am I saying that right? I think so. Then in my senior year, I had the lead in Beyond the Horizon, which wasn't quite as, Eugene O'Neill, I think, wrote that. It wasn't quite as exciting for me. I did a lot of debate work while I was in high school, and as you can tell, I always like to talk a lot. But I was at the high school, or junior high school and high school debate club. Then my senior year, my junior year, my mother moved in as a housekeeper for the girls' dormitory in Findlay College. And as you can tell, we always worked our way through school and through life. I worked at Penny's, and I worked at Walgreens drugstore, and I worked at Isley's ice cream shop, and I delivered magazines in those early years. When my mother and I went to, when my father came back from the Navy and was discharged, he became a VA hospital chaplain in Memphis, Tennessee, where they were bringing paraplegic patients, veterans, for special treatment. And my mother moved down there with him, and I went to live with another family, the Alexander family in Findlay, for my senior high school year. So I became pretty independent. The next year I spent the summer in Memphis, and then I went back to Bowling Green State University for my freshman year and had a job working in a restaurant there when I was not in classes. The summer after that, I went back to Memphis and stayed with my parents that summer, and I went over to Memphis State and decided to go there for the rest of my college. And fortunately, the very early days there in 1949, I met this beautiful woman who was, she had gone to Ole Miss her first year, and she lived about a block away from Memphis State and had decided to go to school there too. And in 1950, we were married. She was working in the dean's office. She was a business administration audit type of person. Those were her specialties in college. She was in the dean's office one day when a person came in and said they wanted to interview someone that could pass the highest level of secrecy for a job in the FBI office in Memphis. And Katie said, "Could my husband apply for that?" And they said, "Well, sure." And fortunately, I passed their test. I was called a security patrol officer then, and worked with the FBI for 5 years. The 1951, after we'd been married for 11 months, our first child was born. And that was the summer when I spent my second term in officer candidate training, this time in San Francisco at Treasure Island, in the same building where my father's office had been, my bunk was. And unfortunately, when I was due to come home in 3 days, our first child was born, and I was not able to be there. I went to the commanding officer and I said, "I've finished everything except this little parade we have for the admiral who's coming in." And he said, "My lad, you're necessary for the beginning, but not for the birth of the child." And I didn't get to see that, but I got back about 3 days later. We all traveled by train in those days. We worked for the FBI, and I finished college, and Katie finished college. We had our second child in 1954, and then I decided, well, I guess my Navy Reserve problem after that first year, they said I was going to be called up and commissioned to active duty, and I decided I would have to do that. So we moved again and got ready for me to be gone and Katie to take care of the kids. And then Mr. Hoover called the Navy, I'm told, and said, "We're keeping him here. You can't have him." Fortunately, I was doing some critical work at the night shift with technology and photography and radio and so forth. So we continued to live there with our kids until I decided to go into the ministry after our second child was born. And there we were attending a Cumberland Presbyterian church, and I worked there for quite a while. My first calling was to go back to school. I went to seminary at Memphis Theological Seminary now. I then did some post-grad work in the field of counseling at Garrett and Northwestern universities in the Evanston area. I served churches in Cherry Valley, Illinois for 2 years, and then I decided I better go back down to Birmingham, Alabama from 60 to 62. Things were pretty tough there then. And I served a Cumberland church there. And then I decided the Cumberland church was a little too conservative for me, and I went back into the mainline Presbyterian church in Lafayette, Indiana for 4 years. Just before we went to Birmingham, our third child was born, David. And while I mentioned our third child, all three of our children ended up being psychologists, which I did my postgrad work in clinical psychology and pastoral counseling at Northwestern and Garrett. We moved after 4 years at Lafayette, where I became more involved in the broader ministry, and we went to Centerline, Michigan, where Detroit Presbytery wanted to relocate the church there into Warren, and it became Celtic Cross Presbyterian Church. I was there for 25 years. During those times in ministry, I was moderator of Crawfordsville Presbytery and of Detroit Presbytery and the Synod of the Covenant. I was involved in administrative things quite a little, as you can tell. Then I went to serve different interim pastorates after 25 years at Celtic Cross. I was interim at sort of the acting head of staff at Grosse Pointe Memorial while I was still at Centerline for 4 years. Then I went to Topeka, Kansas for 2 years, where the pastor had been put in jail for some poor behavior. Then I came back to Northville, Michigan, was there for 2 years, and then to Dearborn, Michigan for 2 years, and then to, where did I go after Dearborn? Then I went to the Presbytery of Detroit. No, I went to Ypsilanti for 2 years after Dearborn. And after I'd been 2 years in Ypsilanti as the interim, I became the Presbytery executive for a year while we made some adjustments in the Presbytery structure. After that, I went into the position that Mike Lindvall invited me to do here to start the resident ministry program. The Lilly family had given us a generous endowment to start a program, something like medical residency for young ministers. We've now had 30 people go through that program. They're here for 2 years and then move on. Been very rewarding. I have so many other things I could talk all day, as you can tell about. My wife's background has been to support me in ministry and in life, which she's done extremely well. We have some health issues now that we're dealing with, but I think we're in a good place for that. I have some mementos all around. This grandfather clock you see off to the side perhaps is one that Katie and I made on our 25th anniversary. All of our furniture in here, old oak material, and this chair I'm sitting in were pieces that we got at used furniture places, old antiques that we refinished and enjoyed remaking things. I have a lot of trinkets. I'll take you in and show you some of those if it's all right now. Pictures here of our 70th anniversary, our coming out the wedding door, leaving for our honeymoon, our 3 children over here. These are different collections from places. This is a communion set my dad had in the South Pacific. That's one I got in Israel. This is one my oldest daughter made for me. I guess I helped her make them little. These are some sculpting that I've enjoyed doing, and all the family memories are in here. Up high over here is something from Switzerland, the rooster, Katie's father's World War I experience in France with that old shell casing made into a chalice. Now, should we go in the other room, look at that? Looks like we have about 1 minute left. You want to get over that way? Here are three pictures. We've traveled a lot in different countries, but Switzerland's one of our favorite. We took our whole family there for our 50th wedding anniversary, which has been 20 years ago now. Over in that far corner is the family tree picture for the Beerys out of Switzerland. They came here to Philadelphia in 1727, and that family tree is one that I painted to make it look like that. Then over here we have some of my trinkets. As you can see, I like to keep memorabilia. These are pins from different organizations I belong to. These were academic ones, these were Navy, these were FBI, these were ministry, crosses, service clubs. This is some carving I got in Israel. This cross is one of my interesting things. Those two rings on it mean that we're bound together in our marriage by our faith. I have a lot of roosters around, as you can see. Those are symbols that remind me not to deny Christ. And I'm into genealogy. I have 128 pages of ancestry that I send to each of the great-grandchildren when they're born. We have 8 grandchildren, 8 great-grandchildren, 6 grandchildren, 3 children. They're very important to us in my life, our lives, both of us. I think that tells my story.
Jesus calls us o'er the tumult of our lives while restless seem. Day by day his sweet voice soundeth, saying, Christian, follow me. In our joys and in our sorrows, days of toil and hours of ease, still he calls in cares and pleasures, Christian, love me more than these. Jesus calls us by thy mercies, Savior, may we hear thy call. Give our hearts to thine obedience, serve and love thee best of